Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that you will agree with me that some of the words of the Dalai Lama, considering our present crisis as, first of all, a moral crisis and the sense of each individual, of their responsibility for the world, these are words that Václav Havel himself, in his own way, had formulated in this very room a few years ago. So I think we couldn't have had a more genuine transmission of the sort of spiritual opening to our discussion than we've got this morning. The topic of the forum and of our present session is societies in transitions, and do we have universal aspirations? More than 20 years ago, the collapse of the old regime has brought a huge discussion, literature on the idea of transition, and it is, in a way, interesting to see this debate to return to Prague almost a quarter of a century after. But we are not returning to it out of nostalgia, but because in the meantime, new developments, in a way connected to 1989, have happened in Burma, as we've heard last night from Aung San Suu Kyi. More recently, the Arab Spring has brought back some of these issues. Amin Maalouf, the Lebanese writer, called the Arab Spring our 1989. Well, we will see whether that is actually the case, but it certainly is an invitation to compare and discuss whether there is a continuation, a spread of democratic ideas, as some would want to see it, and confirm, therefore, the universalistic appeal of democracy. But before endorsing such a view, we may want to distinguish transitions from what and transitions to what. Transition from what? There are different types of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes with very different legacies, and that, of course, is crucial in discussing the nature of the transition. And then the transition to what? Not every collapse of a dictatorship leads you to a successful transition to democracy. What Burma or the Arab Spring remind us is the universal aspiration to freedom and dignity. The universal aspiration to freedom and dignity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have universally shared values or universally shared ideas about what that democratic transition should look like. And indeed, what we see is the opening of a democratic space within which that debate about the future of institutions, political ideas can be discussed and determined. Václav Havel wrote a brilliant essay for the 20th anniversary of 1989 about the unpredictability of history. There certainly is not a track on which the democratic transitions are to be set, and we see that actually in the Arab world today. Immediately after 1989, Ralph Dahrendorf, in a famous essay, outlined three conditions for what he considered a successful transition to democracy. He said you need democratic institutions, free elections, you need market economy, and you need a civil society. The first one you can do very quickly. You can have a free election in 6 months and some kind of hastily drafted constitution. a market economy, functioning market economy, that is a longer endeavor. It may take 6 years. A civil society, that's a long-term endeavor. It might take generations, perhaps 60 years. Yet the whole issue of the society in transition is how to articulate these three interdependent dimensions with very different chronologies. That is what is at stake, and that is an issue which I'm sure will come up in the discussion of this distinguished panel. And since we are slightly running out of time, I will immediately ask for a brief introduction each of our speakers, and they will have, of course, the opportunity to return to it later on. So short initial statements. The first one, Dhaif, who is chairperson. I see they wrote to me chairperson of Bahrainian Revolution and Anti-Violence Organization in Bahrain. So very delighted to have you open this panel. You can speak directly.
Good morning, everybody. I really feel awkward to speak after His Holiness the Dalai Lama, where he spread all this happiness and positive energy. And you have someone like me who's actually dealing with the torture victims and survivors. And coming actually from a very dark spot, which is the Middle East and the Gulf countries, where maybe some of you are not aware of what's going on, and especially to talk today about the issue of transitional justice and international and inspiration. Well, I would go to that later, but to go specifically on the transitional justice, I don't want to be very pessimistic, but we have no such thing. I mean, we don't see any glimpse of transitional justice in the horizon, especially in the Middle East and in Gulf countries, where all these, we can put them under one title, the totalitarian regimes and monarchies, whether they're all kings at the end of the day, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's in Tunisia, whether it's, no matter what names you call them, sultan, king, emir, president, but it's the same system and the same mentality. And the transitional justice, what requires acceptance of the reality and admitting mistakes, and to go back to the culture of their mentality, where most of these come back from tribal roots. It doesn't exist, and it doesn't make any sense there. These ruling families, they do lack of this culture of admitting mistakes. So the will of reforms and the will of transforming their societies into better societies does not exist, especially if we look at the fact that in my part of the world we live in police countries. They call it security apparatus, security what, but it is a police systems. Like, for example, can you imagine going to a hospital? All hospitals in my country is under the administration of a general. A general in the army runs a hospital. That's the situation. So, in conclusion, no basis for that where I come from. And the NGOs, the international NGOs or the international system have introduced the culture of human rights. So people are aware of that. But the transitional justice, we do lack that kind of education. There are some few successful cases, but not many, like in South Africa or Northern Islands. But we need further education, and we need to be told about these stories. We need to know where it begins and where it ends and how to do it. Transitional justice is a duty, and it's more than a right. It's a process, it's a mechanism that we need to be aware of and to learn about. So I'll make this brief, and I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the concise presentation, and I'm sure the question of transitional justice will come up, if only because we have speakers from South Africa, for instance, and other places where this issue has been discussed. Our second speaker is Monsignor Dominik Duka, the Archbishop of Prague, who needs no introduction in this town.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends. Využiji příležitosti domácího pobytu a budu hovořit v rodném jazyce, také i proto, že ne perfektně ovládám angličtinu a mám-li trochu reagovat bez přípravy na to, co slyším, bylo by to trochu kostrbaté. Já bych asi chtěl jednak toto shromáždění pozdravit.
First of all, I would like to greet you all, and we heard the name of Václav Havel remembered. I remembered a film which ended very pessimistically, but with hope, with
omlouvám se. Myslím, že
I think that if we were to evaluate the 21st century after 11th of September, then we might adopt a view similar to that we had when evaluating the 20th century. In spite of all the terror, dictatorship, concentration camp, gulags, violence, I think the 20th century cannot be called only a dark century, only a century of liquidation of human being, because we, the people of the 20th century, are here. And we know that this was a century of men and women who have proved with their lives what true humanity it is. And thanks to their positions, thanks to them, we can say that this was the reason why the empire of evil disintegrated. And when I say empire of evil, I don't mean the Soviet Union only. We heard the mention of a moral crisis. And this, of course, has a foundation. And we have to start by answering the question, who is a human being? Who is man or woman? Man can be defined as bon Dieu diable, as Sartre called it. Man loses value, and with a good intention maybe to protect nature, to protect creation, man is described as an enemy. If we want to say that there is hope, this is not fantasy, this is not utopia, this is a fact. After thousands of years, man is here and can answer, I am here. I am here as a free human being, as a thinking being. And this is the hope. This is where the prospects are. Here, I might not quite agree with the Dalai Lama. Prayer is not a waste of time. Prayer is a challenge to start action, and during this action, to respect the other human being, to be aware that every single step I take must be a responsible one. Thank you. Thank you very much. And with this, I would like to give the floor to the third speaker.
The chairman from Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition from South Africa, Delighted to have you here in this panel.
Well, good morning to you all. And I want to take up from where His Holiness the Dalai Lama left it. I think the greatest challenge we face in the world today is the deficit of moral leadership on the global stage. And I really want to use this opportunity also as a South African, from the bottom of my heart, to apologize to the Dalai Lama for my government turning down his request for a visa to visit our country. Because I don't think it reflects the views of the majority of South African citizens who acknowledge that as a great spiritual leader, he was invited by another great spiritual leader, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to come and celebrate his birthday, his 80th birthday. And I think that is an indication of the absence of moral leadership, because I remember meeting him in 1995 when I was part of the cabinet of Nelson Mandela, and no one told us who we could issue a visa to. So I was 4 years old when my family and I were evicted from our home because of the color of our skin. Apartheid became known as a heresy that stole our human dignity. And it made us very angry as young people. And then we discovered that it was not just the whites we were angry with. We were angry with a system that deprived us of human dignity. And so that process of struggle that created a political stalemate which brought us to the edge of a precipice of a racial civil war in the late 80s. How did we step back from that? And that's the critical question that faces us today in so many places around the world. And there's a few lessons that I think that I can share with you on that. One is that change has to come from inside a country. There has to be national leadership. Even with the best intentions, the world cannot solve problems within countries. The second is that you've got to have national leadership, extraordinary people who are able to rise above the fray and see that the alternative to a scorched earth is a political settlement. But they're extraordinary in the way in which they understand negotiations, because negotiations are essentially about compromises. And we have to go back to our constituencies and convince our constituencies to make those compromises. And sometimes they are very unpopular compromises. And then there's the idea of transition as we know it. There is no big bang anywhere in the world. If you look at the South African transition, from the time that Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, and the time we put into place the transitional mechanisms that allowed us to create and manage the transition, the political negotiations at CODESA, the National Peace Accord that tried to regulate the role of the police and build unity amongst different political parties on the ground around the actions we wanted to take, whether it's protests or marches or demonstrations, right down to the constitution-making process. That transition on the political transition only ended in 2000. It took us a decade. When we deracialized the final level of the political transformation, and that was the local government elections. And I think what was core in that was values. How can we go from representing constituencies and our individual positions to a shared vision of what we want to replace an authoritarian dictatorship? And that's where we came together around a shared vision, a constitutional democracy based on one person, one vote in a unitary, non-sexist, and non-racial South Africa. And if I look around me today and I look at the crises that we see, not just in transitional societies, but including here in Europe, what's happening on the TV screens that we see in Greece or Spain or Italy or Portugal, there is an elephant in the room that, again, the Dalai Lama talked about, the youth. If I look at Africa, half our population of 1 billion people is under 19. The average age of our head of state is 62. Now, if we do not realize that youth bulge has aspirations, and they have to understand and find meaningful democracy, Because the question they are asking, whose democracy is this? Whose rules are this? Can we have democracy that allows the type of human greed and accumulation where 300 people own more wealth than 3 billion people? Is that just? Is that democracy? Is that the free market that we should be embracing? And I think decisively from the Arab Spring to across the world, from Istanbul to Rio de Janeiro to Johannesburg, the young people have rejected that as a premise of building a new future. And I think that is what we've got to look at today in these discussions. And I do not see, I am not a young person. You not are the only young person. I do not see them in this conversation. They're here to assist us. But are they part of a conversation to build a new world? I doubt it.
Okay. Well, if you want, thank you. If you won't see it, my chances are even slimmer, having been branded a man of the 20th century just a little while ago by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. You raise very important issues, deficit of moral leadership. This is what the Forum 2000 has been trying to bring. And the last question that you raised, the process of democratic transition leading to one man, one vote. The question in the transition is one man, one vote once. Is there possible not just to have democratic transition, but also situation of regressions and setback? And this is a question many of us ask concerning Egypt. And we are very fortunate to have a speaker from Egypt, Mr. Ahmed Maher, who is a blogger and activist, and who can give us his perspective on what is happening in his country.
Thank you for this chance, and thank you. First of all, I'm very happy to be here in this country, this inspiring country. Yes, the current situation in Egypt is very complicated after the revolution. After 2005, we were a small group, think about how to make a change in Egypt. I was a member in Kifaya movement. It was the first movement in Egypt started to struggle against Mubarak regime, calling for change, calling for justice, calling for freedom. And the younger groups, we started to find the experience of what happened in Eastern Europe in 19th and 18th, what happened in these countries, how to make a revolution, what happened in Czechoslovakia, Poland, Serbia, Georgia, all these countries. And that's improved our behavior at that time. And we established a movement called Aspirations movement, and then that's movement lead for steps for the 25th of Revolution 2008. But we recognized, or we found, that step down Mubarak is not a revolution. Step down Mubarak is not our demands. Our demands, it's change. What we want, we want Egypt to be better, to have good education, have good jobs, have good salaries, have clean roads, equality, dignity, freedom of speech. That's all. We don't want to be in the authority as a youth movement. No, we want Egypt to be better. But we found that after Mubarak in 2011, the Supreme Military Council take the authority, and they kept the same regime and the same mentality and the same behavior. So after a few months, we asked about where is dignity, where is freedom, where is the revolution, and they saved Mubarak regime. That's led for a change, because the problem that the Islamic groups supported military against the revolution at that time in 2011, and that's led for another wave of revolution in 2012, and the second round of election with Morsi and Shafi. Morsi from Muslim Brotherhood, the pragmatic Islamic movement, and also Shafi, the persons represent the old regime and Mubarak regime. So many of revolutionary groups supported Morsi in these elections. Maybe many big sector now in Egypt consider that a big mistake. Why you supported Muslim Brotherhood in the elections? So that's lead for the same way. The Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi, to be in the authority, they protect the old regime and the old mentality, and they used the same strategy, the same policy. And after a few months, we, as a revolutionary movement, we asked ourselves, where is dignity? Where is freedom? Where is democracy? Where is anything? And that is lead for a new wave of revolution in June 30. So really, it's very complicated, and it's a long-term struggle. Now, after June 30 and after Morsi, it's not easy, and it's finished. I think we need to keep our struggle again, because there is a lot of violation from the old regime or the new regime. It's a mixed system between old regime and some revolutionary. So we need to keep our struggle and to learn from experience and what happened here in Europe also, because the democracy here, you didn't gain it suddenly. You keep struggle many years, and also after the revolution in Eastern Europe, the struggle also kept many years, and there is the old regime tried to come back again to the authority, and so it will take a time, like what happened here in Europe. So in Egypt, I think, yes, we are optimistic. We will make a new waves of revolution to have our really change, our revolution, our dignity, and our freedom, and our social justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, particularly for pointing out the distinction between the revolutionary process itself, the toppling of a regime, and the aspirations that are brought into the open, which often get disappointed. I mean, the topic of revolutions sidetracked or derailed is a very old one. And then there is the long-term transition. That is the idea that the Egyptian or the Arab Spring will take a very different path and will take a very long time to settle. It is not necessarily returning to the old regime. It is not imitating Western liberal democracies. It will be looking for something different, and this is what the Egyptian transition is about, and we will be looking to hearing perhaps more about that in the discussion. Our next speaker is Stephen Gan, a journalist and editor from Malaysia. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Are there common aspirations for societies in transitions? They are, definitely. But it is not democracy. It is not human rights. I think if you look at the dawn of the human civilization, the fight has always been starting from Spartacus, who took on the might of the Roman Empire, to present day. The fight has always been about self-determination, not so much about democracy or human rights. And I think, really, the people rise up against the oppressors because of the fact that they want to be free to decide their own fate, to be free to determine their own destiny, and to be free to shape their own future, for better or for worse. Whether it's going to be a smooth transition or whether it's going to be a painful one, really, I think depends a lot on many factors. And that includes both internal and external. And among them would be whether there is a leadership out there who are leading the change, whether they can actually bring together and forge a consensus among different groups and diverse interests, and whether, and I think this is important, whether there are reactionary forces, just like in Egypt, reactionary forces out there who are trying to bring back the old regime, the old order. Whether the economy is stable enough to put food on everybody's table, that also can determine whether the transition will be a smooth one. The fight against poverty, that is crucial. And I think also whether neighboring countries are willing to lend a helping hand to support the new regime, or whether they are trying to undermine, the society that is undergoing the transition. Now, in that sense, I think we all agree that, really, if there is a transition, not all countries or all societies will lead to better or lead to some kind of utopia, for instance. I think you have to look at all those factors. That said, I think democracy is still is increasingly the common aspiration of today's transitional societies or societies undergoing transition. Now, while the workings of democracy is not perfect, I think we all agree about that, and sometimes we are appalled by the decision of voters. We may not like it, but I think we have to respect the process of democracy. And indeed, we cannot, for instance, support a military regime, a military junta, in bringing down a legitimately elected government in the name of democracy. I think that, for the military to claim that it is doing it in order to save democracy is actually a contradiction in terms. To support such military coups will be a slippery slope for all of us. That's because it empowers the military to be the final arbiter of democracy rather than the people. It allows the military to keep changing the government until the people elect the government it wants. It ensures the military will remain forever the power behind the throne. We have seen it happening in countries like Thailand, in countries like Pakistan. I'm not too sure about Egypt. Perhaps it's still too early for us to say that. And I think multi-party democracy, despite its many flaws, is still the best way for societies in transition to find some level of consensus out there in order for its people to move forward. But for that to make that work, and however difficult it is, to make that work, to make democracy work, the minority will have to respect the majority, and the majority will have to respect the minority. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question of minorities, which you ended with, is of course crucial for the issue, for the future of any transition. In fact, Burma today, this is a crucial issue. One thing is to topple the old regime. The new democracy can be threatened by so-called minority issues or an attempt to settle scores with minorities. So this is a very important issue in the transition. The final speaker in the introductory round, and they will have chance to respond to each other, of course, and engage with you, is Mr. Vytautas Landsbergis, musician, today member of European Parliament, and a former president of Lithuania. Great pleasure to welcome you in Prague.
Thank you, President. Good morning, morning, ladies and gentlemen. In my 5 minutes, I wish to raise several questions for eventual consideration now or any time later. Let us take the topic as a fixed point of departure, societies in transition. About what transition from one stage to another do or would we like to talk? Usually we are keen to think on such matters like moving upwards from lower and worse stage to higher and better one, thus appreciating transition as a progress. Unfortunately, too often we may consider, in a contrary, the regressive transition to something worse. The ways how Mr. Assad have committed in his own transition the terrible crime against humanity and is already forgiven does not bring us an encouragement that the world is becoming better. I'm from formerly captive nation, Lithuania, as many of us who have been under communist dictatorships. We self-liberated ourselves, we are building democracy. It is a positive transition. But recently we can consider, even in a broader scale, that the world is becoming captivated by interdependency with an evil. In spite of more democracy, the new times do bring us the fewer democracy. Along with the keynote of Mrs. Aung Suu Kyi yesterday, sometimes there is the progress which is not a genuine progress. You may call dictatorship people's democracy, but it does not change the matters. Similarly dubious as concept of democracy is also transition. Towards what? Only with proper contextual response the world is acquiring a body. Normally, there should be desired change for a better. But we are sentenced to observe also the changes towards the even worse. Let me take the last point from the popular ideology of consumerism, which in itself is the blind way to less blind abyss. And that sacred word is the growth. Growth of what? Of pollution and irresponsible destruction of our blue globe? The growth of selfishness and cruelty, already that latter among children? Do you agree and praise such growth in commerce if only there are more coins in your pocket? Who would be so outdated to seek for ways towards growth of happiness? I have met one such stranger. He was just among us today, advising to take the things with distinction between good and evil, and not to respond to the hated and harsh words of abuse. The changes in a system will come after we are changeable. His hope was in young generation, the mine as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can start the first round by asking the participants of the panel if they want to respond to anything they've heard from other participants, and then we'll turn to you. So, you want to go first? The 21st century lady will speak first.
Okay, my question here to Jay. Jay, the issue of justice is a natural thing that we know when people are subjected to violations. It's naturally that something they would seek and try to get through applying law, through seeking reparation and stuff like that. And to the Western countries or the mega powers, the big countries, it's when it suits them to put the transitional justice on the table in places that in conflict, it goes and here it's on the table. But in other places, like my part of the world, it's no question. And South Africa was among very few rare examples that has made that transit. Why there isn't any enough studies? Why there isn't? Why it's not yet introduced in the curriculums where for the youth, for the new generation to take that and absorb it and then make it through this rough time, because we see, especially in the Middle East, why it's rough, why it's a very hard transit, because of the lack of experience, first of all, and we cannot get access. Okay, fine, we know our rights, but we can't have the tools that you've used to pass this and to reach to where you are now.
So,
yes,
directly addressed to you.
It's nice being questioned by young people, because I think if you really want to have democracy, you've got to have young people banging on the doors of people who hold power. And most of them are my generation. And my generation has brought this world to the edge of a precipice. You know, I chair a global foundation today dealing with hunger and malnutrition, which is a public-private partnership. How do we work with civil society, private companies, and governments? But I know today that 1 billion people will go to bed hungry. And what can we talk about human dignity or justice when you cannot put food on the table for your children? And what Mandela taught us, because you've got to have that moral, visionary leadership, that fighting poverty is not an act of charity. It is an act of justice. So justice sits right at the center of our narrative about transition and where we want to go. And what we have to understand is that discrimination, oppression, exclusion is all made by men usually, not women. And it can be removed by the actions of men and women, of integrity, of moral leadership. And that's where I support completely what the Dalai Lama is saying, is that what we need today is young people to stand up and find your voice and assert that voice. Because when we stood up in 1976, I was the age of many of you young people in this room. And we were smashed. Many of us, our leaders died. Many had to flee into exile. But it took us 18 years of very painstaking work amongst the poorest of the poor, amongst workers on the factory floor, women in the rural areas, students, to build that tsunami of hope that created the political stalemate out of which a negotiation arose. So I think that that's very important. There needs to be a sense of urgency. Time is running out for us. I was in a meeting with climate scientists which predict, based on fact, that if we do not do something about climate change, in the next century it will rise by 4 degrees. That will cause an even greater devastating crisis than we have today. So I think what we need is to share this intergenerational knowledge. My role is not to lead you. Your role is to lead yourself. My role is to share our experience, to support your voice, and support your struggle for your human dignity. And that has to be done within your country. Solidarity is very important, but I think that at the core of it, it is your struggle. The question is, what can I do to support that? By making available our knowledge of what we went through, making available the tools, and today you are a very connected generation, much more connected than we ever were. You are the 21st century. And you must use that power, because at the end of our struggle in finding voice and developing your narrative is the notion that it's your information and knowledge. It is your needs that must be part of this narrative. And I think forums like this must create the opportunity for greater dialogue, like we are having.
Thank you very much, particularly for that last point you mentioned that, of course, you can get support from outside, but at the end of the day, it is always an internal dialogue within a society. There are no blueprints that can be easily transferred from one country to another. I was wondering whether there are other members of the panel who wish to respond to something they've heard during that first round. About our Egyptian friend, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. I want to make a comment about the role of the military in transition. After Mubarak, after February 11, 2011, maybe the Egyptian trust the military, and we thought that the military can lead transition period in Egypt as well. But we found them, as I mentioned before, that they have the same mentality and they try to protect the same and old regime. And the generals can't understand what is democracy. That is a problem, and that is the issue. Make the situation in Egypt is very complicated, more than any country after revolution. So when I follow the experience in Czech or Slovakia after the revolution, they spent many years in transition period. But in Egypt, really, it's more complicated because the military governed Egypt from 1952, and they controlled many secret issues and the main issues in Egypt. So it's very hard to have our dream about democracy when the military ruling Egypt that way. Now, this conflict and this hard situation in Egypt now, it's very complicated between the deep state. The deep state is the military and police and the persons, businessmen, network from Mubarak regime, and also the new power want to be in the authority, Muslim Brotherhood. So that is the conflict. That is the battle between these two forces. And where is the revolution in this war between the deep state and the Islamists? The revolution just have hope and just have dream that in the future they will have real demands of revolution and real change. So that is the reason make us now wait and keep talk about human rights, keep talk about justice, keep talk about dignity, because our speech now is not wanted from the authority. Anyone now talk about human rights, talk about dignity, talk about state of law. So the authority now, no, don't talk about that. We are in war against terrorism. Don't talk about human rights now. But we insisting on to talk about human rights and dignity and state of law, because that is our revolution. That is our change that we want. So it's very complicated. And we know that it will take a long time to have a change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. The important point about the different understandings of what democracy may be. Everybody refers to it, but there are very different understandings when the transition begins. Some people think it's simply possibility for the majority to impose everything. Others think the protection of those who are in a minority is just as important, and therefore the question of constitutionalism, the rule of law, this is actually a crucial issue in the transition. And what you said at the end, you know, human rights, justice, freedom, well, this is basically a message now addressed by your generation to both sides, to the military and to the Islamists. And yeah, for too long we have been squeezed between the idea that we have only the alternative in the Arab world between the Islamists or the military. What the Arab Spring represented was the possibility of a third option.
The third voice or the third square. That's defend about the real demands of revolution. Yes, the Islamists made many mistakes and fatal mistakes when they took the authority that year. And also, the military can't understand what is democracy and what is freedom, and they don't respect that. They consider that is nothing. They talk about democracy and freedom. So we need to keep our struggle and our efforts to have real change and real revolution and real state of law.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if other members, I don't. The Archbishop of Prague.
Já bych jenom chtěl říci jakési povzbudivější slovo, abychom neviděli v těch nezdazlých pokusech opravdu konec. Ale rovněž tak bych asi si dovolil říci, že pro tu část světa, která usiluje o demokratický systém, asi tak docela nemůžeme říci, že my v Evropě jsme pro ně úplným vzorem. Dovolte mi jenom jednu otázku. Když řekneme, že demokracie
Let me give you an example. When we say that democracy is the rule of the majority, then at the same time we have to say that in many a country in Europe, it is the minority that rules the country because we have no quorum. For example, look at my country. For example, in our parliament, where half of our MPs never come to the sessions, can we then adopt a sensible law? On some occasions, perhaps yes. But there is one thing we must bear in mind, namely that at present both the young and the old very often refuse or reject civil society. They pursue their individual interests. For example, now during the pre-election campaign, look at what is happening in some restaurants. A restaurant would, a party would have its own restaurant, and they would then have their own discussions. When you go to a country where democracy was born, it meant that police met, police debated, police knew it had certain authority. And we know that in the world today, we truly need to understand that there are a number of countries that have a new setup. Some people would call their country monarchy, some would call it a republic. But we know that there is also the problem of cases of castes. But equality of human beings does not mean that we are all the same, that we all understand everything. That would not be true. And I believe that this transition of a society also means that we all need to understand what is at stake, what is being decided within a community, and also what should be exposed to criticism, and to what extent things should be left to those people who truly understand these issues. Look at the situation in Europe. Our society here is divided into two halves, and these two halves very often cannot and are unable to communicate with one another. Very often, for example, also our parliamentarians do not give us a good example. Very often they simply leave the scene before things are decided. But we cannot keep on saying that we want democracy, but at the same time, very often I do not take into account and very often despise ideas of some other people and their opinions. And I believe that the media can play an extremely important role here. And very often, media can send out certain dangerous messages that may lead to a dictatorship of some sort. There is something else I would like to point out, namely that the question of poverty is a basic human right. This is not only a question for charities, and also in our country we can see one thing, namely that freedom is not always free as we know it from the Korean War, because when I'm not responsible, when I decide to enter the public scene and I do not know what to do, how to do it, then this may result in the fall of democracy. Just like communism was not the rule of working class, because otherwise I would have been one of the rulers, because I worked as a menial worker. But at the same time, we cannot say that democracy can exist only
by creating a certain space for it. We should understand that democracy is based on certain values, and if we say that, for example, communism was a betrayal of the intelligentsia that was infected by kind of utopia. Today, we are in a different situation. We say, yes, freedom, yes, but at the same time, we say everything is possible. We have been talking here about corruption. In my opinion, corruption is often a political tool, a political instrument. Let's call a spade a spade. Let's speak about embezzlement. Let's talk about theft. Let's talk about these things. In our country, too, you can have posters. I mean, there are no ethical rules applied to these posters. These are so-called official statements. But if you look at the Quran, for example, and you read the surah about man, then you can initiate a debate about what man is. For example, when I go back to what the Dalai Lama said, I do have a precondition that will lead to discussions about human beings. When you look at Plato, at Aristophanes, I mean, these are not ideal, but they are certain foundations for our discussions, and I'm afraid that our society today misses exactly this. Our society today is being ruled by this idea that everything can be manipulated with the help of the media. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monsignor Duka, for reminding those embarking on transitions to democracies in various places about the sometimes sorry stage of democracy in some of the more established democracies in Europe. And what you said at the end, that they may be shared aspirations, but what about shared values? What kind of values are the foundations of the new democracies? And that's where perhaps there are differences in different parts of the world which our speakers represent. Mr. Landsbergis, you wanted to? Yes, you have the floor.
If there is at a time some remark on democracy. While taking democracy as checking on our way, we have to see and define that there are plenty of stages between democracy and non-democracy. The building of democracy is an endless process with 4 stages. Some of them could be called pre-democracy in a positive transition, post-democracy or failed one, the case of negative transition. Then further reversed evolution down from non-democracy to anti-democracy, with real examples not so far away. Such classification is always helpful, maybe helpful to understand the nature. To add any clumsy definition like liberal democracy, like in a contrary to tyrannic democracy, may introduce nothing but confuse. If there indeed an idea about variety of democracies is falsely promoted for use. Let's compare it with variety of types being half pregnant. Or if I go now putting things from questionary on more real way, we may have a pregnancy in the Western sense. As for me, democracy is democracy, desired achievable or not, debated about promotion, either hated and blamed openly as colonialism of our days, and that's all. I'm going after tomorrow to Democracy Forum. It is the body and organization trying to unify parliamentarians and parliamentary bodies pro-democracy, and we must be care to be able to make a distinction between democracy and what is only calling itself a democracy. I have mentioned those people's democracies, communist dictatorships and tyrannies, but calling themselves democracies. So let us look at the essence, not at the word only.
Yes. People's democracies of Eastern Europe. Milan Kundera said 3 words, 3 lies. They were not popular, they were despised by the people, they were not democracies, they were dictatorships, and they were not even in Eastern Europe, they were in Central Europe. So, yeah, democracies with adjective is always a tricky debate, but we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience, so please raise your hands. I think there is a microphone somewhere. And so, first, you two here, yes, and then we, hopefully, maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions and then see how the panel responds, because time is running short now.
Good morning. My name is Jan Trnka. I work at the Charles University in Prague. My question is about moral leadership and transitions. When we look in the history, some of the transitions that we remember, that we know, most of the time, that was the time when moral leadership actually appeared. And then it disappeared as it was swept away by pragmatic politicians, pragmatic politics. So my question is, and would the panel like to answer that, is it possible that moral leadership is only possible during transitions, that it's not actually possible during normal times, normal politics? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Second question here. Tady před vámi.
Good morning. My name is Petr Hedbavny. I'm also from the Charles University in Prague. My question is very simple. It's if we want to have democracy in a system of belief where man is by the scripture superior to a woman, how is it at all possible to have democracy in a country which is ruled by such a system of belief? Thank you very much.
And third question over there. And then whoever on the panel.
My question is to Nada from Bahrain. Do you really have champion cases of your work? Do you have stories of success with regards to rehabilitation? Thank you.
Did you hear that?
No, can you repeat again?
Could you repeat your question and speak into the microphone? I don't think it was...
My question was to Nada from Bahrain. Do you have champion cases, stories of success to tell about this rehabilitation in Bahrain?
Okay. All right. So who on the panel would like to address the first question, the leadership? Basically, is exceptional leadership the product of exceptional times? In other words, this was what you were saying. There is a revolution, there are exceptional situations, and so is this, or can we have exceptional leadership for everyday politics?
Yes, I think that's a very relevant question, because if you look at South Africa today, we face some really great challenges in our transition. And those are moral challenges. You know, I'm coming from a place, the poorest of our provinces, where $100 million has been stolen from the healthcare system. And babies are dying because of that. and people are denied just the most basic health care. And so, yes, these are great challenges, and I think what we've got to do is move away from the notion that there will be a Messiah to come and deliver us, to a notion of what are the checks and balances on power. Because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's an old adage. So what are those checks and balances? One, it's a constitutional democracy where you have a separation of power, where you have an independent judiciary, where you have independent media that is fearless in exposing corruption. It's about civil society, whether those are trade unions, women's groups, student groups, standing up and finding their voice. Even if you get attacked, it's to be fearless in how you build that. So I think there are some governance issues, which are the architecture of governance, but they're insufficient to ensure that there's true democracy. Our biggest challenge, I think, in my country is that when we went into government, I was part of that government, it was part of my mistake, we disempowered our citizenry. They became bystanders, and we said, government will do all of this for you, deliver you houses and jobs and clinics, and people just sat and they waited. So I think the question really we have to ask, how do we bring accountability and governance and performance, whether that's in the private sector, the public sector, or in civil society, into the core of our debate about democracy, and not leave it to just voting every 5 years. Yeah. And there are not clear answers to that. That's what we have to experiment, and that's why it's such an exciting time. My generation fought for political freedom. We now know that's not sufficient. Your generation has to define what does that political freedom translate into a meaningful future of hope and opportunity.
So maybe you want to...
Yeah, but first yes. I'll answer to the two questions. Actually, the frustration where I come from, my part of the world, which is the lack of leadership. But I thought about it several times. Do we truly need the leadership? Why people can't lead themselves? Why this normal person, a normal woman, or a normal man can just stand up on their feet and rise up and make difference within their societies and community. And then the power of change will be driven by the mass. Well, it's absolutely fantastic if you have a one figure that can lead the nation. But what happens in most cases, in majority of stories, we don't have that Superman. So any woman can be a Superman or Superwoman. So this is a possible and doable. And that leads us to the third question, which is any champions or success stories. Well, actually, like the NGO I'm running myself is a success stories. All the founders of that NGO are just simply normal people, normal doctors, practicing their life, and they were really not involved in politics, but they were doing their duty, and suddenly the regime went crazy and decided to punish them, and jail and prosecution and blah, blah, blah. Myself was an example. I was sentenced for 15 years imprisonment for treating injured protesters with torture and with horrible stories. It's not about me, but we stood up and we tried to change within our community and change. And another fascinating story that I dealt with just last month, and luckily BBC covered it in Bahrain. This student, he was just 17 or 18, and he was arrested carrying his books, going to do his exam at school when he was arrested by security forces, beaten up, taken to jail. And he fought while he was in prison just to give his final exams. And though, like, the security forces didn't want to take him to exams, he missed lots of his exams, but yet he scored 98%. 98%. That is a success story. That's when people change. While he was in prison, while he was under torture, he stood up. And he decided to continue and fight. And that's what we need. These are the role models. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel? Yes, you.
Perhaps I'll answer the second question regarding whether democracy is possible without equality between men and women. Definitely it's not. I mean, I think we all agree on that. We often talk about one man and one vote, but actually it's really about one human and, and one vote, really. I think it's only until recently that non-whites are given the right to vote. It's only until recently that, only until last century, that women are given the right to vote. I think, increasingly, we really have to, ensure that everyone has a right to vote, and the vote is equal. And that's not the case now, because I think we already talked about, the problems of democracy. Definitely, I could see that in many countries, people who got more money is able to buy votes. Their votes is much more powerful than the poor, for instance. I've seen, leaders who use their money just because they are tycoons. They have they're billionaires and all that, who can actually buy elections. And I think that's something that we have to fix, because we cannot allow that. That is not one human, one vote. The other thing I want to mention is about young people. I think young people has more power to change than at any other times in the world, really, because you have the internet, and that is a powerful tool. It's really, I've seen it, being used in many countries for change. My country, in Egypt and elsewhere, and that could, be. You need to harness that tool. I being, an editor of an internet newspaper, I've seen it, being able to influence change. And I think, that's something that you need to harness that tool for change.
Thank you very much. Well, the last point about internet as a tool for democracy, we know this can work wonders. We also know that on the internet, you can have very different and very conflicting values expressed in the democratic process, and it may lead you to the segmentation of the polity as much as integration. That depends on the situation. Anyway, this would be a different debate. I will not try to sum up or conclude in a long way, perhaps just 2 words. One, careful what you wish for, because you may get it. The Central European experience is you wanted democracy, the market economy, and Europe. Guess what? Democracy not doing too well. Market is in crisis. Europe is in crisis too. That's a normal state of democracy. Once you finish, this is no longer about transition. This is a quarter of a century after, you cannot be talking about transition. This is the normal state of democracy with all its ups and downs. And the second point is, what we have discussed here, the changes in the Arab world or in different parts of the world and democratization, they take place nowadays without necessarily having Western democracies as a reference point. We always thought that because the West invented democracy, that somehow it remains a reference point. No, you have democratic processes now which are not the same as Europeanization or Westernization. This is very different from Eastern Europe 1989. And therefore, that leaves very much open the question, what are the values, the underpinnings on which the democratic process will develop in the future? That will be discussed in future panels and perhaps in future Forum 2000s. I wanted to thank all the panelists for their very interesting contributions and you for your attendance and your questions.